All right. So, today we conclude the intertestamental era of Foundations for Faith. And in 2 weeks after Thanksgiving break, we will shift into the life of Jesus. So thus far, we've covered the Apocrypha, we've covered the Macedonian kingdoms, and how they are presented in Daniel, anticipating the intertestamental period. Today we're going to look at the Maccabean revolt and the rise of Rome, which happened roughly concurrently. So the Maccabees. Remember the word Maccabees? We learned it a couple weeks ago. It's part of what?
The Apocrypha.
Apocrypha. There's first Maccabees and second Maccabees. They're not sequels. They're just two different versions of the same events, different perspective on the same events. Kind of like Kings and Chronicles give a different perspective on the kingdom period in the Old Testament. So the Maccabees were actual people, and that's what we're going to be looking at here. So last week we left off at Daniel 11:21 with this guy, Antiochus IV, Antiochus Epiphanes. Daniel says, "In his place shall arise a contemptible person to whom royal majesty has not been given. He shall come in without warning and obtain the kingdom by flatteries. Armies shall be utterly swept away before him and broken, even the prince of the covenant." And we see Antiochus IV fulfilling some of this. He had a brother who was supposed to gain the throne and was supposed to inherit the throne, but that brother happened to be over in Rome at the time, and so he wasn't available. And so Antiochus saw the opportunity and put himself forth as the king. But he doesn't fulfill all of the prophecies about him, which is why he is looked at as a type of the Antichrist, a foreshadowing of what is to come. So, what gets covered in the books of the Maccabees is his dealings with the kingdom of Judea. Remember, Antiochus the Great conquered Judea from the Ptolemies, so Judea shifted from being under the rule of the kings of the south, now it's under the rule of the kings of the north. And when Antiochus gets on the throne, he embarks on this policy of Hellenization, and that is trying to enforce Greek culture on the Jews at the expense of their normal Jewish culture. And that starts in 168 BC. And it was actually in a response to what he perceived to be a revolt, but it was really just an internal squabble apparently amongst the Jews. But he forbids all the Jewish customs, and then he does the worst thing that you could imagine. He sacrifices a pig, which is an unclean animal.
It's like asking the Jews to hate your guts and try to kill you.
Yes, sacrifices a pig on the altar in Jerusalem. Sacrilege of all sacrilege. And that is foreseen in Daniel 11:31 through 32. "Forces from him shall appear and profane the temple and fortress, and shall take away the regular burnt offering," which is exactly what he did.
Yo.
"No more cattle, no more heifers, we'll have pigs on the altar. And they shall set up the abomination that makes desolate. He shall seduce with flattery those who violate the covenant, but the people who know their God shall stand firm and take action." So Daniel prophesies this in 534 BC, and it actually is fulfilled the first time in 167 BC. This is what's recorded in 1 Maccabees on the 15th day of the month Kislev in the year 145, and that's from the beginning of the era of the Greeks. It says, "The king erected the desolating abomination upon the altar of burnt offerings, and in the surrounding cities of Judah they built pagan altars." So Antiochus was making use of a division that had arisen amongst the Jews at this time. They had been ruled by Greek kingdoms, or Greek-cultured Macedonians, for a couple hundred years almost, solid 150. And there was one group of Jews that were like, we should become like the Greeks because they rule us. And there were other Jews who said, no, we have to remain pious and observe all of our traditional customs, and especially everything in the law of Moses. We cannot do anything Greek. And one of Antiochus the Great's forebears, no, not Antiochus Epiphanes' forebears, had set up a Greek gymnasium in Jerusalem. And the Greek culture was men gather at the gymnasium to fraternize with one another and to exercise, and they would do that in the nude. It wouldn't be a big deal, except Jews had this peculiar custom of circumcision, which is particularly noticeable when you don't have any clothes on. And so Jewish men were particularly self-conscious about being circumcised, and the Greeks would criticize them for their status, and that was something that they suddenly started wanting to reverse. And there's all kinds of other Greek customs and worshiping the Greek gods, and Antiochus Epiphanes, of course, takes this to the full nth degree by sacrificing pigs on the altar. And Jerusalem becomes desolate because of this. All the Jews start getting persecuted by the Greeks and by Antiochus, and they leave Jerusalem, and the city is desolated, which is why they call it an abomination that causes desolation. Now, interestingly enough, almost 200 years later, Jesus speaks this. So when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel, standing in the holy place, let the reader understand, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. What do you notice about Jesus' statement here?
It hasn't happened yet, according to him.
It hasn't happened yet. So the Maccabees, or the writer of the Maccabees, looked back and said, this is when it happened. And Jesus, 200 years later, is like, when you see it, because it hasn't actually happened yet.
So do you reckon it's like this will happen multiple times, or it's like here's a small scale, and then theoretically maybe when the Muslims take Jerusalem, there's another scale, and then maybe it'll happen again in the end times?
Yeah, it's hard to say. It seems to be one of those prophecies that has a first fulfillment and a second, more full fulfillment. Much like Jesus' first coming was the first part of him coming, and then he's got a second coming, which is only evident and clear now that his first coming did not fulfill all of the prophecies in the Old Testament about his coming. He's not ruling in Jerusalem yet. He has not vanquished all of his enemies, but he said he was coming back.
Oh, so that's why they thought he was going to do that, because they...
Yep.
Oh, that makes
So
sense.
it's one of those challenges when you're interpreting the Old Testament is what was referring to the first and what is yet to refer to the
So
second.
the Pharisees weren't wrong, they just were misinterpreting it as all in one fell swoop instead of being in two groups.
Two groups, exactly.
Okay.
So Antiochus Epiphanes ends up being a type of what is to come. We get a shadow or a foreshadowing through what he did of what is to happen. Something similar, don't know what, can't specify, lots of theories, I don't want to even try to get into them all. We just know it has not been fully fulfilled yet. Now, for our purposes today, as you can imagine, the Jews did not react to his actions particularly well. They revolted, and is known as the Maccabean Revolt, which lasts about 7 years from 167 to 160. So there was a Jewish priest by the name of Mattathias, and he had 5 sons, and those sons are oftentimes referred to as the Maccabees, but it was really, the first one was Judas, and his nickname was Maccabeus, which is the hammer. So he was Judas the Hammer. He smashed a lot of things.
I can imagine.
Yes. He was like the forerunner of the Hulk.
The original.
And Thor. Exactly. The original Hammer Time. Now the Jews were really at a disadvantage, and so they conducted more guerrilla war. They did not hold any of the key territories. They were outside Jerusalem, out in the countryside, staying away from cities, but they were harassing the Greeks thoroughly enough and long enough that it started pulling in some very large army units from the Seleucid Empire. During this time, Judas actually sends a couple relatives of his over to Rome, and they make their first diplomatic contact with Rome. And the Romans promise to be good friends and come to their defense and their aid, but it's kind of soft, like, we want to be friendly with you, mostly because if you are a snare for the Seleucid Empire, we might be able to maneuver and gain some advantage. The Romans did not actually do too much off of that, but they did make a diplomatic connection. So Judas dies pretty quick. I think on that sheet we see he's dead by 162.
Yep.
but he inspires a lot of people, and he got a trajectory going where the Seleucids were just never able to really hold Judea particularly well. And so by 142, Judas's brother Simon becomes a high priest, and during his high priesthood, they gain a measure of autonomy within the Seleucid Empire. And this level of autonomy just keeps growing. Simon dies. I believe his son, John Hyrcanus I, gains the high priesthood after that. And under his rule, there's even more autonomy that is growing and growing. And so at this point, the Seleucid Empire only nominally has control over Judea. Judea is really orchestrating their own affairs, and they're more like a petty ally of the Seleucid Empire. They're not fighting against each other anymore. Now the Seleucid Empire is going through interterminal decline at this point, though, and so 103, Alexander Jannaeus gets the high priesthood, and he is a full-out priest king. He is fully independent, and the Hasmonean kingdom is fully independent of the Seleucid Empire. The Seleucids have no impact on what they're doing there. And during his reign, he actually restores the borders of Judea back to what they were in the days of David and Solomon.
That's a lot bigger.
Yes, I'll show that to you on a map here when you're done with notes. There. Not quite ready, okay. Now you ready? No. Okay. So, as you can see, through the course of this, the kingdom here is growing larger and larger. It starts off under Judas. They just own the countryside. They don't own the cities in that light pink area. And then they get a little bit more, and then they get a little bit more, and all the purple is what Alexander Jannaeus adds in, and they have an autonomous kingdom there. You've got a little city-state of Ashkelon that is independent. They are actually fighting wars against the Nabateans to the southwest or southeast, and they are very independent at this point in time.
Isn't Ashkelon like that area's gotta be like 5 miles by 5 miles square or something. That's gotta be really small.
Yeah, maybe 12 by 12, but 8 by 8, it's not particularly large. City-state, this is common back then.
Wait, so is Ashkelon then like Philistines or like what ethnic group is that?
I'm not sure what ethnic group that would be actually. It may be some remnants of the Philistines. It could be a Greek city-state at this point in time. I don't know.
Alright.
Huh.
Alright, so we're going to pause here at the Hasmonean Kingdom because Alexander Jannaeus is independent, and we're going to shift our focus over to Rome, and we're actually going to go back 650 years.
Yes,
So,
Roman history.
Roman history. Rome was not guaranteed power by any means, in any way, shape, or form. And the history of Rome is kind of surprising when you realize how preeminent it became by Jesus' time. You would think it would have been bigger stuff much earlier on than it was, but it wasn't. There's a lot of controversy over how Rome was founded. There were other people that lived in that area before the Romans did, but the traditional history is that Rome was founded in 753 by a guy by the name of Romulus. And he had a brother by the name of Remus. What?
Oh yeah. I
Yeah,
heard
he had
that.
a brother by
Yep. His brother Remus dies. Romulus becomes the official first king of Rome. And Rome is originally ruled by kings. That lasts for about 240 years. The kings were not hereditary. They were elected for life. But this is a really misty period of Roman history because the records all got destroyed. And so there's not a lot that is really known that very solidly.
7 kings in about
240 years, yeah, it was relatively long reigning kings.
Yeah.
So 509 is the year it shifts into a republican form of government. And the republic lasts until 27 BC, so almost 500 years. King gets overthrown in 509 by the Senate, and they replace the office of the king with 2 consuls. And that is a Roman institution that is unique at that point. The consuls are appointed by the Senate for 1-year terms, and they set it up so that there were 2 of them, and they could only do something if they both agreed to do it.
Oh, I remember learning about that.
And they usually end up getting one consul from one faction and the other consul from the other faction, and so that'd be like having 2 presidents of the United States. One's a Democrat and the other's a Republican,
So basic.
and they'll never
Nothing
do
ever
anything
happens.
unless they both agree, which means it must be really important and in Rome's favor.
So.
And the
So it'd be like if our election was like the Republican primary and the Democrat primary were like the final election, and it's like, alright, there's your 2 leaders.
Yep.
That wouldn't go well.
No, it wouldn't go well. And the Senate liked it this way because that kept the power with them. Because the Senate wanted to be able to hold the reins of power. They were afraid of too much power vested in an individual, or even 2 individuals.
Wow,
And then the
who was
1-year
that?
term allows for a quick change. If we don't like a council, we can get rid of him next year and never put him there again. But this actually changes Rome's trajectory quite substantially. At this point in time, you look at your map, Rome is just that little tiny dark red area in Italy. And they are one of many, many city-states. But the Republic had a very expansionist mindset and tendency, and so this is a small beginning that became huge. Now, to put this in context, 509 is when the Persian Empire is reigning from Turkey all the way to India. This is when Darius I is on the throne, and they are this massive empire that has most of the known world.
Oh,
And
the
Rome
Persia?
is this tiny little city.
Oh, Alexander the Great has not happened.
Alexander the Great has not happened yet. Nope. So, their early expansion starts with the First Latin War. The funny thing is that Rome speaks Latin now, or that we always associate Latin with Rome, but they weren't actually Latin. They were in the neighborhood of the Latins, and the Latins were their first target of expanding. See how this turns up here. Alright, so you see all the little orange cities.
Yeah.
That was a confederation of Latin cities, and it's kind of like an ethnic group. And in the First Latin War, Rome was able to gain a position of prominence so that they were the first of those 30 Latin cities and the chief amongst them. So Rome got to set the foreign policy, and everybody else falls in line behind them. And so this is their first expansion, and that gives them preeminence in their little neighborhood. But like I said, that's a really little neighborhood. They have a serious reversal about 100 years later. In 390 BC, Celts from the north in Europe come down to Rome, and they sack Rome and cart off a whole bunch of wealth. And that sets Rome back quite grievously. But they bounce back, and they start fighting wars against the Samnites, which is their next neighbors. And then they have another war against the Latins that further dissolves the Latin League. But one of the most significant things that happens in that second Latin war is that when the Latin cities are subjugated, they are granted some rights and privileges, and that tendency of Rome to grant rights and privileges to the people they conquered endears them to their conquered peoples so that they're willing to fight for them and stay part of them. And this is something that the Caesars used to their advantage a great deal more in the imperial period. The Republican period, they kind of dabbled in this. But this allowed them to trade with Rome and have some privileges of that sense. And so the rich people in Rome and the rich people in the cities that they subjugated had a vested interest in maintaining trade relationships and peace, tranquility, so they could remain prosperous. So let's see, at this point they grow to hold just a little bit of territory there in the center of,
So kind of that lighter red.
yeah, that lighter red.
And Maybe.
the pink and the light red and the dark red.
Oh, pink and.
Yep.
Okay.
But they don't have the orange yet. So, found this map, and this gives you a great global context. This is all the other kingdoms of the world at 300 BC. So you got that big monster. The blue one is the Seleucid dynasty. 300 BC is a little before Antiochus the Great, but they're pretty huge. You got the Mauryan Empire over in India. The Ptolemies are the yellow in Egypt. They control Judea at this point in time. White there on North Africa is the Carthaginian Empire. They're quite large. And you got Macedonia and Illyria and the kingdom of Lysimachus, because this is actually right when Alexander the Great's generals are fighting all their huge battles to figure out who is the greatest.
This is a tumultuous time in the earth.
Very tumultuous time in the world. And Rome is just that tiny little red thing in the Italian peninsula with plenty of neighbors that are roughly their size and plenty of big empires that could swallow them up if they chose to. So Alexander the Great had all kinds of great intentions of conquering the rest of North Africa. Had he not died in 323, he would have gone into North Africa and conquered the Carthaginian Empire. And then he would have gone into Spain, and he would have looped around and landed in Rome, and he would have conquered the entire Italian peninsula. And if he was still bored and still alive at this point in time, he would have remembered that there were so many vast territories in India that he was so close to, but he needed a bigger army and soldiers who were willing to fight. And he
And
likely would have gone back over to India to conquer the rest of the world that we don't know about yet, but is there to conquer.
That dude was something else.
He was something else.
Or he would have found Kush.
Yeah, going up the Nile River would have been another option, but it wasn't mentioned on his agenda. Anyway, so Rome is a small player here. They're still expanding. While the Greek commanders of Alexander the Great are fighting amongst themselves, Rome is expanding in central Italy. Second and Third Samnite Wars. And this gives them a strong hold on all of central Italy. So this gives them the Orange territory there as well.
What year was the third Samnite War?
298 to 290.
298 to 290.
Dang.
This is enough to shift Rome into the League of the Great Powers in their neighborhood. They were not the greatest power, but they were now a great power. They were no longer a small, minor power or a medium
They were
power.
Regional powers.
Yep. So then they fight another war against Pyrrhus. Pyrrhus actually was a relative of Alexander the Great. And his kingdom got involved in a war in southern Italy, and that war did not go well for Pyrrhus or his kingdom, and all of southern Italy ends up in the hands of Rome's too. Ironically, Rome is allied with Carthage in this war, and then they fight the Punic War against the Carthaginians in 264, and that one lasts 23 years, fighting back and forth. Punic is a Greek word that refers to Phoenician. Do you remember where the Phoenicians are from?
Yeah, they're from kind of north of Israel.
Yep, just north of
Just
Israel.
like
Tyre and
Tyre and
Sidon.
Sidon.
And Tyre is the city that Carthage was colonized from. Carthage was a Phoenician city-state, grew preeminent in North Africa. So after the First Punic War, which goes favorably enough for Rome, they end up with all that territory on the map. They've got Sardinia and Corsica, a fair chunk of Sicily, they've got the entire Italian peninsula, most of the way up to the Alps. There's just a few pieces in the north there that they haven't consolidated yet.
That was 263 to 221, right?
264 to 241.
241.
Yep,
So many dates.
yep. And that map shows where Carthage is. It's in northern Tunisia today. And so then we get to the Second Punic War. And the Second Punic War is a war of great ironies, because this is when Hannibal the Great is rampaging across Italy, And Hannibal actually set up a kingdom in South Italy that was his own kingdom. It wasn't even directly subservient to Carthage, but he was never able to lay siege to Rome and actually take the Romans out. And so for the Romans, this was mostly a war of endurance, and they just kept being able to levy more troops and levy more troops and levy more troops, because the Romans had the goodwill of their allies and their neighbors that they had previously attacked and subjugated. They had manpower reserves that the Carthaginians did not have, because the Carthaginians had subjugated a large empire, but they did not have the favorable reputation with the people they had subjugated. So they only unwillingly sent troops to help fight for Carthage. So at the beginning of that Second Punic War, this is what the map of the Mediterranean looks like. You've got Rome covering the red zone there, Italy, Sardinia, Corsica, and most of Sicily. And Carthage has got the entirety of North Africa and also a good chunk of Spain there. And after that war, Rome has everything that's in green.
Oh.
And Carthage is much smaller. Carthage was reduced to just the area right around their city-state, because they were not allowed to have an empire anymore. So they were stripped of all their power, and Rome captures a fair chunk of Spain in the course of that. So they're growing power, and they just keep expanding. The Senate was very voracious in its appetite. So then we have growing eastward, because nobody else in the west is a threat. They shift over to the successors of Alexander the Great's kingdom, and they fight 3 Macedonian wars and a Seleucid war, which that's the one that's referenced in Daniel 11:18. That's when Scipio Africanus runs into Hannibal over in the area of Rhodes, and he also is over there with Antiochus the Great and defeats him. And then we have the Third Punic War, and that is what erases Carthage once and for all. The Romans completely had destroyed the city, depopulated it, sold everybody off into slavery, and then they salted the land, and it wasn't rebuilt for 100 years. So after this, the Roman Empire includes most or the orange area as well as the green. So there is nobody left in the western Mediterranean.
What was the dates for the third Punic?
Could you go back
149
one?
to 146. So maybe next or in 2 weeks for the cahoots, it should be like, did the Third Punic War start in 157,
No, please don't.
149, 143?
That would be absolutely brutal.
That would be terrible, wouldn't it?
I don't think anyone would get more than 3,000 points.
Uh-huh.
Except for
Okay, did you get enough there, Annabelle? Alright. So Rome has vanquished everybody in the western Mediterranean. There's nobody who's a threat over there. There's just minor powers that they haven't conquered yet.
What, like Mauritania?
Hmm?
Like Mauritania?
Yep, like Numidia and Mauritania. Those are small independent kingdoms that are favorably aligned with Rome at the time, so there's no need to send armies over there to subjugate them more properly, because there are plenty of hostile powers in the east. And the east is also much more densely populated and thus much more wealthy. So then we end up in the late Republic era expansions, and these are the Mithridatic Wars. And these wars, I think there's 4 of them, honestly, but 3 of them, 3 Mithridatic Wars. They're not named after the kingdom, they're actually named after the king. Mithridates was king of Pontus, and Pontus was a power that was growing quite large in the vacuum of other states in their decline. So the beginning of this, the eastern Mediterranean looks like this. Rome and Roman-friendly territories are pink and red. Mithridates territory is in green. You can
That's
see
a lot.
the Seleucid Syria there is really small compared to
Hey,
what it once
That's
was.
southern Ukraine.
Yep, southern Ukraine was a
In
Greek
Russia.
culture. It's known as the Cimmerian Bosporus. It was an independent Greek kingdom all the way to well past the Roman era. Yep.
Wow.
So
Yeah, there's ruins over there.
I wonder if they're getting destroyed.
Not too many yet, but
Hasmonean kingdom.
yes, the Hasmonean kingdom, you can see there is independent at this point in time. And that is south of the Seleucid Empire, and the Seleucid Empire is a shadow of what it once was. And remember, the
Yep.
Seleucid Empire used to stretch all the way over to
Oh
India
wow, now Parthia took that over.
and Parthia, which was a Persian tribe of sorts.
and-
They arose and they revolted from the Seleucids and started taking territory.
Oh, and
As in
Armenia.
Media.
Yep, Armenia and Media are other kingdoms that are up there, and so, and you have the Ptolemies down there in the south.
What are the two different colors of green? So it's
Allies of Pontus and Pontus proper.
Okay.
So this is what it looks like at the beginning of the Mithridatic Wars. And the third Mithridatic War is the one that was particularly decisive. And what happens is you have the Kingdom of Pontus going up against the Roman Republic, and they were roughly evenly matched. This war lasts for 9 years and is not going favorably for the Romans for a long time until they put Pompey in charge of the command. Part of the reason it went so bad for the Romans to begin with is they were dealing with an uprising and revolt over in Spain, and it's really hard fighting wars in multiple fronts, but the Romans always were, which means you're usually taking it in the teeth somewhere so that you can settle things in one place. And so Pompey was over in Spain, and once he had dealt with the Spanish revolt, then he was repositioned over there into Turkey, what's modern day Turkey, fighting against Mithridates. So he defeats Mithridates and ends up annexing Syria, and he subdues Armenia, and it becomes a client kingdom of Rome. It's not fully subjugated, but it is pacified and favorably disposed towards the Roman Empire. And so at the end of this, we end up with a map.
Gonna have to go back by the way. At some point.
Okay, I'll just stay here, finish writing your notes.
So Israel is just this tiny little nobody to Rome.
At this point in time.
This is the worst handwriting I think I've ever done. Okay.
Okay. So then we get to this map. And the red shows where Rome is at and where they have annexed territories directly.
Well, so that's just north of.
And that is
The
just
Hasmonean.
north of Judea. In fact, they own the city-states along the coast of Judea. And Judea is really reduced to the hill country of Galilee and Judea and Samaria.
Wow.
And what ends up happening is there's actually a civil war that's going on in that time frame there too. But this pushes Rome all the way down up to the border of Egypt there. Egypt is still independent though. It's still under a Ptolemy or Cleopatra or both probably. But at the same time that Pompey lands in the neighborhood over here and annexes Syria outright to subdue it and pacify it and keep it from fighting in civil war, you've got two sons of Alexander Janus vying for the high priesthood and the kingship in Judea. So these two sons are Hyrcanus II and Aristobulus. And this is where we start seeing the political parties of the Jews arising and becoming influential and such. So Hyrcanus is supported by Pharisees,
Oh.
and Aristobulus is supported by Sadducees. We'll hear lots more about them in the future. They have become a thing. So Pompey is beseat or sought after by both of these guys, and he ends up deciding to reinstate Hyrcanus II in Jerusalem. So that ends the Civil War, and he reigns until 40 BC. But this very much makes Judea a client state of Rome because a Roman commander decided who gets to rule down there.
Wait, so who is the? Could you go back?
There's so much information there.
I know, it's so much information.
Aristobulus.
Aristobulus, he's the one who loses.
So presumably things don't go well for him.
Nope, things don't go well for him.
Is that why the Sadducees were kind of a lesser political faction in the time of Jesus then? Or why it seems like they're a lesser political
They just make
faction?
fewer appearances in the New Testament.
Oh.
So,
I would say they're lesser, because
They're not
the high
lesser.
priest was a Sadducee.
yeah, yeah, there was a lot of people in the Sanhedrin that were Sadducees.
Okay.
It's just the Pharisees interact with Jesus on a more frequent basis.
Yeah, I suppose that'd make.
Yep. All right. So Judea becomes a Roman client state because Rome is the one who decides who gets to rule Judea. And they put Hyrcanus II on there. And like I said, he reigned until 40 BC. And this is interesting because he was a relatively weak leader, and a rising star in his court is a man by the name of Antipater the Idumean. Idumea is the Greek reference to Edom. Do you remember who the Edomites are?
Yeah, that's Esau.
Esau's descendants, yes. And so Antipater is one of Esau's descendants, and he aligns with the Romans and is very, very good at figuring out which Roman is going to win. And that was important because mostly been focusing on the Roman expansion, but there's all kinds of internal conflict going on in the Roman Empire. Pompey and Julius Caesar were rivals for a while, and Julius Caesar ended up winning out. Antipater was aligned with Julius Caesar when favorably timed, and then he ends up dying in 43 BC. I'm not exactly sure why, but that is just before Hyrcanus II
Oh,
is taken off the throne.
Oh, damn.
And the event that ends Hyrcanus's reign, if I can go forward.
oh, I'm so sorry.
You want to write every single tidbit down. Do you ever reread these notes? Have you ever read any of these notes from last spring?
But see, what it is for me is when I write it down, it puts
You
in
remember
my
it better?
memory
Okay, good.
which is
Yeah.
necessary for Cahoots.
It's the opposite. If I write stuff down, I forget it.
Then I forget it, I know. Do whatever you find best.
Okay.
Antipater who could anticipate the winner.
Yes, Antipater who could anticipate the winner. And in 40 BC, the Parthians invade. And what happens here is they actually were not trying to invade Judea, they just were invading Syria because that was their point of contact with the Romans. So they invade Syria. And a guy by the name of Antigonus wants the high priesthood in Judea, and so he sends messengers to the Parthians and says, give me soldiers so I can become ruler. And so the Parthians sent him just a small detachment of soldiers, but it's enough, and he's able to take Jerusalem. And Hyrcanus gets exiled to Babylon, which is under the rule of the Parthians at this point in time. And Antigonus becomes high priest for just a handful of years. But remember, Antipater was the father of Herod the Great, and this is when Herod the Great comes on the scene. And Herod the Great is famous for what?
He was the Herod who tried to kill baby Jesus.
Yes, Herod the Great was the Herod who tried to kill baby Jesus. So this is our link into the New Testament here. So Herod the Great flees Jerusalem when the Parthians invade, and he goes to Rome, because Rome is the center of power in the day. And while he's in Rome, the Roman Senate just loves him, and they declare him king of Judea. But of course, he's not actually a king there yet, because the Romans don't even control Judea. Is it just so easy to give gifts that you don't actually own and possess? However, they do give him an army with which to go invade and very capable commanders.
Yeah, that'll do it.
Oh, so
That'll
that's
do-
why everybody hated Rome.
Yeah. So you've got Aristobulus there, who is a client of the Parthians, and all of a sudden the Romans land behind Herod the Great, and he conquers Galilee and Judea in short order, and then he lays siege to Jerusalem in 37 BC,
Oh goodness.
and they take it after a short siege, and the Romans actually behead Antigonus. They treated him worse than any other king they ever conquered, actually. And that makes Herod king of Judea, but he is a client of Rome once again. But he was a much stronger ruler than the last one, Hyrcanus. So this is how you have Herod the Great, who is king of Judea when Jesus is born.
That makes sense, and it also makes sense why he in the nativity movie he's afraid of being betrayed and killed by other people because
Yep.
in the Roman Empire that's all that ever happened.
Right.
Everyone's looking out for their own personal gain. Fathers are being turned against, or sons are turning against their fathers.
Yep.
Wait, who's his son in the movie?
Archelaus or another Antipas. Yeah,
Antipas.
Antipas. Yeah,
I think it's Antipas. I think that's how they say it.
Antipas. Yes. So, this is just about the time that the Roman Empire actually forms. So the Republic for about 100 years has been suffering from all kinds of civil wars while somehow at the same time expanding their borders and conquering neighboring kingdoms. There's a final war between Mark Antony and Octavius Caesar. Mark Antony is in love with Cleopatra, and he has taken refuge down in Egypt with Cleopatra. The two of them are defeated, or their army, I should say. Maybe it's even their navy. They're defeated in 31 BC at Actium, and Octavius is declared the Pharaoh of Egypt. And this is kind of funny because he's a Roman general, and he's now the Pharaoh of Egypt, and so Egypt is his own personal possession. The Senate has no authority there, but he does. And he returns to Rome, all victorious, and he is declared Augustus by the Senate in 27 BC.
So Octavius turns into Augustus.
Yes.
Is that where October and August come from?
October does not come from that, I don't believe. August comes from Augustus.
Right.
October is the 8th month in the Roman calendar. Just like September is the 7th, and November is the 9th, and December is the 10th.
Oh, yeah, okay.
Their calendar year started in March, with spring, I believe. But, anyhow, he becomes the first emperor of the Roman Empire. He maintains the mirage of the Senate actually having power and influence, but really he holds all the power.
Genius.
So this is how, when the census is declared that Jesus, or takes Joseph and Mary down to Bethlehem, you have Augustus Caesar declaring a census must be taken, and Herod the
Oh,
Great
that's probably right about him.
is on the throne in Judea, which is very closely aligned with Rome.
Wait,
Yeah, hold on.
I'm slow.
It's okay. So if you ever want to study a tumultuous period of history, the period from Alexander the Great to when Jesus is born is probably the most tumultuous period of history in ancient world.
What about
Because you've got amazing great power struggles and wars going on, and most kingdoms are fighting multiple wars simultaneously on different fronts, and it's always a death struggle, and whoever doesn't win is usually dead.
That's crazy.
Mm-hmm.
What about the Genghis Khan?
Yeah, that's not the ancient world.
Really?
No.
When was he?
Ancient is
exactly
before
right.
500 AD. Then you have the Middle Ages or medieval history, and that would
What was
include
Genghis?
Genghis Khan. He was like
Who's that recent?
1300, 1280,
Are you
something
serious?
like that. Yeah.
That's
Yeah,
What?
Marco Polo spent time in his court.
Yeah, Kublai Khan's court, I think.
Was it
Oh,
Polo or
I think so.
dang.
Genghis? I don't know.
I need to
Kublai was his
Yeah.
son, so it would make sense.
Yeah, it was like late Middle Ages.
Dang.
Same time as Black Death or something.
I did not know that.
I need to
Also,
figure
no
out
wonder
when
the
all this
population
happened.
there had significantly decreased
Yep.
over time. Genghis Khan killed like millions and
Holy
Yeah.
buckets.
Kublai killed even
All right, so this is what the Roman Empire looks like approaching Jesus' birth here. So they got Egypt because Octavius got that when he defeated Mark Antony and became Pharaoh of Egypt.
Mm-hmm.
They've picked up all the rest of the Spanish peninsula. Julius Caesar conquered all of what's now France, and
Wait, when is Julius Caesar?
Julius Caesar was in 45 BC.
Oh, Julius Caesar was before.
Yep, before Augustus Caesar. Octavius Caesar was a nephew of him or something, not a son.
Didn't Mark Antony, wasn't he the one who tried to go after all the murderers?
I don't remember. There's so much drama, and I can never keep them all straight.
Can't remember either.
That's why we just ignored all the Roman civil conflict and strife. That's what most Roman history focuses on, and I was just like, we're gonna ignore that. We're just gonna look at their expansion wars.
Good idea.
The interesting thing to remember here, though, is that with Herod the Great on the throne in Judea, that's actually an independent kingdom. They are definitely aligned with Rome, friendly with Rome, but they are not actually Roman. So when Jesus' parents flee to Egypt, they're crossing a border outside of which Herod the Great has no power, and it's a different authority entirely.
Oh, I did
They were
not.
passing into the Roman Empire.
Interesting.
I
Mhm.
never made that connection.
And it's not until 6 AD that Judea is actually just made a province of Rome.
Interesting.
So they didn't like the ruler there, and so they got rid of him and put somebody else in
Wait,
place and
but
said,
they
all right, now you
were-
pay taxes to us for sure.
Wait, so what were they? Who were they paying tax? Were they just paying taxes to Herod?
Yep, and Herod probably sent some tribute to Rome.
Presumably, if they were being censused.
Yep, I don't remember the exact agreement.
But
Like,
then
it's
they-
clear there's a very close relationship between them, but Herod the Great was much more independent, and it was not considered a Roman province until after.
But Rome
Archelaus
had boots
gets-
on the ground. In
Yeah, I'm not sure how many Roman soldiers were there, but like the United States has boots on the ground in 20 or 30 or 50 or 60 countries in the world.
yeah.
They're still independent. Alright, so that was a deep history dive. We won't do that most any other week here.
So that was before they conquered Britannia.
Yep, that came later. They have not jumped across there yet,
Jumped across to. Oh, yeah.
so. Anybody have any questions before we wrap it up?
How long did Herod the Great live?
He dies in 4 BC.
4 BC.
And he's
So
replaced by his son, presumably.
Yep, he's replaced by his son Archelaus. And that we'll learn about next time in 2 weeks.
Fun.
Because we'll be doing Jesus' birth, and those are all the events around Jesus' birth.
That's crazy.
Most crazy indeed.
Alright.
So has there been a rise of a city-state empire like that, similar to that? I suppose Alexander the Great
Macedonia.
kind of had a dramatic rise, kind of
British
like that.
Empire.
Oh, yeah.
Macedon, British Empire.
Yeah.
The United States.
Yeah, to some extent.